Often in business schools, there's a lot of talk of business strategy. And of course, when you set up a business or you're growing a business, you need to be very strategic. And I will make reference to strategy in various contexts, as I've already done in relation to branding, for example. Day to day, a lot of business, though, comes down to more tactical kind of things. And if we're talking Japanese terms, you might make a distinction between, say, strategic or strategy is very senyaku teki, and tactics is more kind of micro in the here and now, more saksen teki. I'm not going to overemphasize that distinction because there is a little bit of the element of lost in translation. But the tactical thing is a little bit more short term. But we can understand the tactics are looking to be realizing, of course, the interests of your business or your organization, your venture, your own personal interests, or trying to affect some kind of change. It might be to affect some kind of social change. And tactics take a whole range of forms. Sometimes they're very psychological, trying to understand the motivations for human behavior. And sometimes they're more ultimately structural. They understand that in particular circumstances, people have incentives which will tend to drive them to act in a certain way. And you need to understand those structural dynamics so that you're not naive and taken advantage of. Game theory, for example, gives us very good insights into those structural dynamics of choice. A little bit on the psychology, though, the very first image we've got here in the slides, and I'll toggle over now to make the slides bigger than me. This is a sign that's put up on a wall which happens to be outside a sports bar in Glasgow. And Glaswegian guys are pretty famous for their love of a drink and love of a challenge. And you could imagine guys who would be hanging out at a sports bar on a Friday or a Saturday night, for example, would love a challenge. So you come out of the bar, a sports bar, and there is a wall, and you're with your mates. It's going to be pretty tempting to climb up that wall, isn't it? So I guess they've had a problem there for ages with people trying to climb the wall. So someone, a local official, has decided, we need to stop people climbing on the wall. And there seems to be some clever paint that you can buy which makes a wall slippery. So, but then they probably thought, if we paint the wall with this slippery coating and someone tries to climb it and they fall off and hit their head and get injured, they might sue us. Well, I guess we better put a warning up. But on a Friday night, outside a sports bar in Glasgow, a sign that says, "Warning, anti-climb, paint applied," to a young man a bit liquored up, that is an invitation. And what we can see, of course, is not only is it an invitation to try and climb the wall, it's an invitation to climb right over the sign. And plenty of people have succeeded here. We can see lots of lovely, dirty footmarks where guys have made a very clear, very targeted attempt to leave their mark on the sign to demonstrate what a silly endeavor it is. So I'm sure tactically there might have been better ways to get at the wall climbing thing. Sticking razor blades all over it might have done it, but then again you might again get sued. Okay. By the way, the cynics in auto design say that the more you do to actually make cars safer, the more comfortable people feel about driving a car in a dangerous way. And the cynical take on it is the best way to get people to drive very, very cautiously is to stick a spike in the middle of the steering wheel. And that will certainly slow them down and make them more responsible. Let's think about some of the challenges that businesses face that bring tactical issues to the fore. A big set of issues, of course, relates to just selling the product. You can pitch your product. You can do so many things, of course, to get customers to engage with your brand, to find your product in the market, to come and check it out. But in the end, you've got to get them to commit. You've got to get the customers to enter their credit card details on your website, for example, or to hand over the card, or to touch off, or whatever they have to do to buy your product. So getting the customers to commit. Interestingly, though, we shouldn't assume that customers are naturally averse to spending money. Remember, money is only valuable in that you can get something in return for it. Okay, so our caution tends to be more that about whether we're getting good value for money, whether we particularly need this item, or whether we would be better off saving our money to buy another item at another time. So very often the concerns from a customer's point of view are not about the cost per se, but more about their own choice set. Is this the best thing for them to spend their money on? And are they feeling confident in the selection or the decision process that brought them to this point? So this is an immediate warning against really high pressure sales techniques. They can drive your sales revenues up, but if you give too much of a hard sell, you can scare people off. So you actually want to ease people into the purchase decision so that they feel, first of all, an imperative to commit, a need to commit, give them an incentive to do it today rather than tomorrow, because they probably won't do it tomorrow, okay? Because either they will have reframed it, or they'll be busy, or they'll buy it from someone else. So you want to get them to commit, but that final commitment comes about when they have a degree of confidence that the process that's led them to this point is a reasonable one. Okay, so it's about removing barriers to resistance, but in particular the psychological resistance to committing. It's often said novice salespeople make a really basic mistake in forgetting to ask for the sale. You know, they give the pitch, they explain the value of the product to the customers, but they never actually ask the customer to buy the product. Okay, they just think that the customer will do this, but very often the customer just needs a little bit of a nudge, not too much, but a little bit of a nudge. Another key challenge is to avoid hold-up. Hold-up is a ubiquitous problem in business and so much of life. Now, the hold-up can be simply that people who are supplying us with things that we need to make our product or deliver our service mess us about, take advantage of us, want a higher price, for example. It can be held up by your own staff. They are a critical business input as well too. Another area of risks and challenges for firms is the problem of lock-in, that you get locked into a contractual arrangement or a technological application, for example, which requires you to continue to pay and pay and pay. On the other hand, if you can lock customers in and can get a continuous stream of payments from them, this can be very good. Locking your own staff in so they can't readily quit to go to work for others as well is another feature. For example, one way the companies have historically locked in their employees in a Japanese context with things like retirement allowances, taishokin, and pension funds that are not portable. You can't take them from one place to another. I am very much locked into Waseda. If I was to quit in a chuta hampa, in between kind of way, if you work for quite a while in Waseda but not long enough, you get a really, really bad deal in terms of your eligibility for subsequent pension entitlements. And a lot of people don't quite realize that. They come to work for Waseda or very often other Japanese universities, and they suddenly realize, okay, well, now I have to be here for the long haul. Otherwise, it's going to be relatively costly for me to quit. And we'll look at some more examples of lock-in a moment in a whole range of business contexts. Another thing you'd like to do, of course, in business is to discourage competition or to discourage people from entering the market to compete with you. But you want to do that legally because we have Fair Trade Commission in Japan, we have antitrust laws in my country, Australia, we have the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission. These days they are very much looking at competitiveness in markets to protect consumers and other businesses' interests, businesses that depend on the products and services that you supply. So you can't just shamelessly reduce competition in a market through unfair means, but there are some ways that you can discourage competitors from entering your market and reducing your profitability. There's also a whole bunch of issues, of course, about getting a fair deal from business partnerships and whatnot, as we can well imagine. From an economics perspective, a lot of this comes down to what economists have talked about, and then negotiation theorists as well, about how to make credible commitments. It's not just that we promise things to people, we promise to work with them, for example. Our promises have to be credible. And we can see that there are various things that happen in business that help to give credibility, authority to our commitments. Similarly with threats, threatening people that you would do appalling things to them to get them to make some modest concession to you, it's just simply not creditable. How often are you going to murder someone unless they move their car in the next 30 seconds from in front of your driveway? Okay, clearly you're showing your frustration, but it's improbable, not impossible if you're a complete and utter maniac, but improbable that you'll actually carry through on the threat. So it is an important consideration. When do you make threats and when do you not make threats? A word of advice: threatening to quit is generally not a good idea. First of all, you should have something else to go to, or confidence that you have something else to go to. But secondly, even if you do have something else to go to, it could be, and very often is, costly, and someone can so readily call your bluff. Okay, they can say, okay, there's the door, bye, have a nice life. Oh, and don't ask for a reference. Then you're left in the very awkward position of carrying through on your threat or not. And if you don't, you end up looking rather silly. Okay, trust, of course, is one of the most ubiquitous problems in a market context and in so many other social contexts. Typically with trust, there's usually too little of it, and circumstances contribute to the lack of trust. Under some circumstances, there is too much trust, okay? And we're often instinctively optimistic, and then once our optimism has been shown to be misplaced, we're often too pessimistic as a response. So we tend to insufficiently update our own stories, frequently in light of new information. We often be very attached to our own initial judgment. So if we come to a very positive view about another person, for example, we're not about to immediately change our mind in relation to a person or a service or a product. We want to see a fair bit of information to know that, well, we have to change our mind. And why do we not like to change our minds? Well, for a start, we don't really want to admit that we've got it wrong in the first place. We all are a little bit anxious deep down about our own calculative computational capabilities in this world of free markets, free exchange, free partnerships, free to be whatever you want to do. There's also a lot of psychological angst that comes from being the complete master of your own destiny, okay? Or any organization that has managerial structures and specialist staff to make the big strategic and tactical decisions. It's awkward for them to turn around and say, well, geez, we got this one pretty wrong, because they will fear that it will reflect on their authority, their capability, their judgmental capability in a whole range of areas. So what we know is that we tend to swing from extremes, from trust to distrust, for example. We often see what we fear based on a past bad experience. It's often referred to as the salience heuristic. We mentally often fight the last war, or if we didn't see something coming, we see a similar threat in a whole range of contexts. And I said in the risk example that there is that old Chinese proverb about a man who's been bitten by a snake will fear rope for 10 years. As I said, growing up in Australia, you fear the garden hose. Well, you fear a snake, and therefore you see a snake every time you see the garden hose at night when you're putting rubbish out, for example. So I just have this picture here, of course, because there's no particular reason to think that that person is scary or dodgy, but context makes a significant contribution to the level of perceived trust. We should be much more on our guard in environments where we are feeling well at ease. Okay, that's where we're more likely to be taken advantage of, because we literally will let our guard down. So people who can make us feel at ease by finding commonalities. Maybe when you're out there in the big wide world, the people you should be most scared of are other Waseda graduates, the really dodgy Waseda graduates who appeal to the common Waseda identity and then rip you off. Okay? So there's a lot in the world that is really about trying to provide assurance. You go into an Apple shop and you get a very strong sense through the materiality of the store that everything is highly professional, it's quality oriented, the store mirrors the attributes of the product. So when we talk about the Apple store, that's not this Apple shop, okay? I'm not going to buy anything from here. So getting customers to commit. I just want to say straight away, I said earlier, it's not really about the money. Money in itself has no value other than look at what it is. It's a bit of paper or something, or it's not even a bit of paper now. It's just a digital balance, and it's all about how we can use that digital balance to get something, or to get one thing, or to get something else. So the real fear is of being ripped off, of okay, that we will be taken advantage of. So naturally people do things to assure themselves. These days we have digital platforms which help to assure ourselves in some respects. You go to kakaku.com in the Japanese case if you're buying a range of electronic goods, and you can see pretty much what the spot market is. Once upon a time you would go into the major electronic stores and, if you looked at kakaku.com, so the staff would be either a bit sad and sulky, or on one occasion I even had someone get angry at me in Yorubashi telling me that that was unfair. These days they do the very opposite. They themselves will immediately go to the market and say, well, this is the market price here. We can't do this cheaply, but it is the dodgy electronics store, that has no physical presence. So you don't want to be buying from them anyway. But amongst the credible businesses, this is the price, and we can come in at a few percent cheaper than that. What do you think? Okay. So they themselves know that the best way to get a sale is to just simply show third-party sources of information that allow the consumers the sense of assurance that they are not being ripped off. So consumers are going to be looking for market information. Very often the first store visited misses out on the sale, even though it's competitive on price and quality, just simply because people want to have a look around elsewhere. So if they're leaving the store, hopefully throw them a sweetener to come back. Understand that people do want to look around. They do want to check their options. And the best thing to do is to be very generous. It's like, go ahead. Sure. I'm confident you'll be back. I'm confident we've got decent prices here and we would love to have you back. And a lot of people will feel a sense of responsibility or debt to the first store who takes the time, obligation, to the staff in a store who take the time to, for example, help you try on the shoes or whatever, offer you advice. And they should understand that you therefore will want to just assure yourself that the price is reasonable, and if so, that you will then commit. That's why, of course, third-party information, if you're confident in your pricing, is actually a very powerful tool. Kakaku.com is a great thing for a salesperson in an electronics store, because you don't walk out of the store and go down the street to Bic and check the price there, or Yamada. Okay, you can see the price on your phone right there, or the salesperson's phone, and so you've checked the market conditions, and therefore you can commit. Okay, so more and more stores are saying we will match any price. Okay, because they know with a smartphone people will be able to do that there. So don't be afraid of meeting the market. Generally, of course, we should all be very wary of one-shot games, unlike repeat games where you're going to be dealing with someone once and you're never going to see them again. This is why tourists get ripped off all over the world. You look like a tourist, you're going to get ripped off because They don't expect you to be back again. If you must negotiate to buy something in a place where there are lots of tourists, try and exaggerate. Emphasize that you either visit a lot or that you're living locally, or better still, have local friends with you who, not because they're locals per se, but because it's just simply clear that it is a repeat game. That if a local brings a friend who's visiting, they might bring other friends who are visiting, and they might talk to other local people, about the behavior of the people in the store. So any situation of like a one-shot game, you have to be wary. But of course, you know that already. So one of the biggest problems in the business context is precisely because people are so alert to this. How do you provide assurance to them in this situation of the one-shot iterations? And some of the things you can do are what I've just mentioned in relation to people wanting to check the market. So customers, savvy customers, switched on customers should always be very alert to the problem of lock-in, okay? Lock-in is any of those contexts where, having signed up for it, it's not very easy to get out of it. Historically, you got a mobile phone contract, and your number was tied to that. There was no mobile phone number portability system in the Japanese context, for example. And so what this meant was that if you wanted to change your mobile phone carrier, you had to change your number, which was an absolute pain in the neck. Although who does voice anymore? Numbers probably don't matter so much anymore. But anyway, with number portability, those problems have been minimized. But we see the lock-in in so many different areas. You should be alert to the minimum lock-in point, okay, when you can switch from one to another. So we see, for example, airlines, when airplanes need substantial servicing, there is an opportunity to switch to a different provider. People have had a car for years, you're pretty much locked into a service contract under the warranty. And then you get to a critical point where you have to buy a new car. Then you make a decision about, well, have I been happy with all these years of these service experiences with the local dealer, with the after-sales service and the every couple of months the car service, and do I want to switch to a completely different service provider? And this happens to some degree with computer systems and whatnot as well. Many years ago, I switched from Windows to Apple around the time when Windows went to Windows 7, which had acquired a reputation for having a pretty clumsy user interface. And I was already quite dissatisfied with Windows because it was really quite silly that Windows always just simply came in these binary language packs. That you'd get the Japanese OS, and then you'd have English as well. And then someone showed me that Apple was just comfortably multilingual, that you could just simply toggle between languages so easily, and there was none of this having to get foreign language, extra language packs and all the rest of it. And for a native English speaker working in a Japanese context, but having to use Japanese documents too, that was just so attractive. And the day it was demonstrated to me, I thought, well, my Windows computer's not real great, and I need to upgrade the Windows environment anyway, and I'm dreading this Windows 7 thing. So I went straight away and bought an Apple computer, and ever since I've been in the Apple ecology. But I am now very locked into Apple because everything I've got is Apple. Everything is synced through iCloud, and the interface of Apple devices is just so convenient that it is really like golden handcuffs, okay? I am locked in, but I'm contentedly locked in just simply because it provides good value to me. But there are times when Apple puts the price up or whatever, and you think, but the switching costs are rather large. Now, just to reiterate, circumstances create distrust. Your good character will be doubted. Don't take it personally, okay? It is completely natural to distrust people in certain circumstances. This, by the way, is again in Scotland, and that looks pretty seedy back street with a purple light shining through there, and you think, okay, that's pretty dodgy. But my recollection was that this actually was a Christian prayer drop-in center. Okay, maybe they deliberately kind of disguised it as a bit of a dodgy place where lonely people go looking for love, and they find spiritual consolation instead. If so, that's actually very clever kind of positioning. Okay, but you take one look at it and you're inclined to misread it, aren't you? But the broader point here is this: don't be offended if you are initially distrusted. Okay, you can't just demand that people trust you. You certainly can't demand respect. Respect has to be earned. There's nothing so pointless as saying, respect me, when people have absolutely no grounds whatsoever to do that. So you have to manage perceptions, understand that the way you present yourself is going to be a significant contributor to perceived trustworthiness in the first place. Okay, so Lockin. Let's just have a look at some of them. I want to mention a historical example, a Japanese example, and this was Sony with their attempt at locking people in with memory sticks. Sony, over many years, tried playing the lock-in game, having proprietary systems and thinking that they have this they had their own memory stick, which was different from an SD card, and you would have a memory stick in your camera, your computer, and whatnot, and your music player. And the idea was that with a common system, people would have all Sony devices. The memory stick, of course, immediately introduced these elementary problems. And well, if you actually want a different camera for a different functionality, well, you're going to have an SD card, and then so why are you therefore going to have other devices which have a non-standard card? So it was pretty obviously a lock-in system. People didn't lock-in driven, a proprietary system, and people were just simply wary about it. There wasn't interoperability, interchangeability with other providers. Now, we see in so many contexts, businesses want to do this to you. They want to get you on a subscription basis model, for example, get you in pay month by month rather than a once-off purchase. Adobe Cloud, which is the world's most commonly used creative suite, which, they're excellent software, and that's why they're the world's most commonly used. But they are hugely expensive, and they're on a subscription basis. Now, that's okay for creative professionals because they're using it all the time and they like the tools updated, and there's a cloud service that both for your creative works and also for real-time updates to the various software apps. So that is a pretty good value proposition for serious professionals, whether they're graphic designers, videographers, or whatnot. Maybe professional photographers working with, say, a web design team. But for prosumers or amateurs, the subscription-based model is very costly, and so there are some very good software alternatives, which, and we can debate this endlessly, maybe don't have quite the full functionality of what you get with Adobe, but are once-off purchases, and so you don't have the same kind of continuing costs. Now, that's just in terms of pricing strategy. Other forms of lock-in are quite common, and you'll see this with software apps. And a lot of them, it's less about a shameless attempt to make it very difficult for consumers to leave you, more about building in certain functionality, but also in practical terms brings an element of lock-in. One of the most common ones are a range of software which provide either a backup service, a proprietary backup service on their own servers. Again, this is often tied to a subscription-based model, or all of your files that are generated within the particular app are stored in a library. Now, some of these library structures in, for example, Apple Photos, if you know how to do it, you can see the structure of it there, and you can find the original files. Actually, Photos is rather messier than iPhotos used to be. It was much easier. But there are many other apps as well, whether it's a note-taking app, for example, so many of them. They store the files within their own system. And this offers certain advantages in terms of cataloging and accessing the content, but it also means that if you then want to change to another app, you have to be able to export all your data, and you have to check that you can do that in the first place. And even when you can export it, it may not be in a desirable form. So there was a lot of criticism, for example, for people who were using Apple's iTunes, that they would lose so much of the structure of their iTunes and all their labels and everything if they were to export it out of iTunes. So my own suggestion to you, it's becoming more difficult, actually, in a whole range of software areas, is to look for those apps which ideally are once-off purchase and also kind of ending third-party storage systems. So can you use iCloud or Dropbox, for example, to sync and store them? And can you create your own folder structure, for example, so you have complete control over the structure of your data? Some of the other classic shameless lock-ins are now becoming much less frequent, partly simply because so many consumers were alert to them and it's not happening anymore. But when internet service providers first arose as a business, they would typically say through ADSL, they would also provide you an email address. And lots of people, the first time they were using your internet, they're saying, oh, I've got an email address, how exciting, and they would use it, and it would be tied directly to their service provider, which meant that they couldn't change the service provider without telling everyone that their email address had changed. So one of the things here is to make sure that your email addresses are separate from any kind of service or organization that you may want to part company with. That's why you want to be very, very wary, for example, of using an email address that is associated with your employer. Because by definition, when you leave your employer, of course, you won't have access to that email address anymore. Some universities have been very smart in allowing people to explicitly committing them to allowing students to keep their email address for life. That's a very nice thing. And it's very smart for the universities because they can find you later on, hopefully when you're super rich, and they can hassle you to make donations, for example. So there are significant implications when you have a market structure, an industry structure, or a product where lock-in is a common feature, where consumers, having signed up for the product, find it difficult to switch. So when lock-in is strong, what you want to do is get as many customers as possible, lock them in, get the customer commitment, and then we say bleed them dry. Okay? So this was long the practice with mobile phones. You would sign people up to 2-year contracts with very high switching costs, not being able to change your mobile phone number, for example, and exit fees. And to get people to sign up, you would have the 0 yen contract, give you the handset for free, no money up front, sign here, and then just pay, and pay. Okay, so a lot of industries we see this. So a basic concept in economics is this notion of switching costs. How much does it cost to switch from one provider to another? The term total switching costs is very much focused on more, in a sense, a total economics perspective on this. So it's the customer's costs plus the new provider's cost of taking on the customer, the total switching costs. So when we're looking about efficiency in an industry, when economists are doing analysis, they talk about total switching costs. But what you really care about, of course, is the customer switching costs. And there are various switching costs, and this term is a useful term. It captures a lot of things beyond financial costs, okay? There are adjustment costs, psychological learning costs, learning new systems, the exit costs, maybe getting out of an existing contract, having to reformat all your data, all of those kind of things. And of course, opportunity costs in engaging in the switch anyway. And a lot of industries, a lot of businesses profit from customer inertia. And you want to be very wary about this with ongoing subscription fees. And indeed, I've got a long list of things I have to follow up and cancel that I'm paying every month that I'm not using for various reasons, that I signed up to them, or sometimes kids signed up to with my credit card, and I have to go in and kind of kill them off. Health clubs, universities, for example, switching costs are incredibly high in Japan. It's just very difficult to switch from one faculty to another, even in the same university, let alone switch universities. Now, in my country, in Australia, the government at one point put a lot of pressure on the universities to increase student mobility between universities, understanding that competition between universities to attract and retain students would enhance the service orientation. So when I was lecturer, later senior lecturer at Queensland University of Technology in Brisbane, in the business school there, before I moved to Waseda, one of the duties we had each semester, we'd kind of take it in turns, is we had what we used to call in-person credit sessions. And literally we would sit at a table and we would have these really big books of precedents, of Zinre, and diverse students would come to us with academic transcripts. Some students would have newly arrived in Australia, or maybe they'd come and they'd been doing an English language course, for example, and they'd come in and say, I was at National University of Taiwan, and I've studied this, and I'm transferring. Can I have some credit? Or I'm down the street at Central Queensland University or Griffith University, and I want to transfer to your program. Okay, and this was so routinized that I would look at a certificate and I would say, oh, you've done this, this, and this. Okay, I often remembered it, and I came, okay, I can give you a block credit, 48 credit electives, and we can get credit for these 3 courses. We'll treat them as equivalent to major requirements. Okay, if you're okay with that, you sign off, I'll sign off with that, and both people would sign off, and I'd say, take the form over there, get yourself enrolled, okay, sign up straight away, and we'll put the credit in the system straight away. And that meant that there was a remarkable degree of mobility of students between institutions. It got to the point where there was so much what we call churn, actually, that some universities, less prestigious ones, were kind of almost a specialist first-year university where they would lose a significant proportion of their students to more desirable institutions. Students, typically the students who did better, who got higher grades and were accepted into another university, would transfer and get credit. And it was without doubt a competitive discipline upon us. So it applies even to universities. In medicine, for example, portable medical records make a very big difference. If medical records are digitized and you can go to a different doctor and through a common ID, your medical record can be pulled up, this creates a lot of efficiency. It's also mightily good if you've suddenly been in an accident or you pass out, you're unconscious, and people can't check your medical history and you've got an ID card. One reason why Israel did so well with rolling out COVID vaccination is they have a very good and integrated national system of medical records. And when they actually went to Pfizer and negotiated a deal, one of the things they said was, we'll anonymize the data, we'll protect customers' data, but we will provide overall analysis of how vaccines, the Pfizer vaccine works to reduce COVID cases. And that was so incredibly persuasive on the Pfizer side. And that's why Israel was the first in the world to roll out vaccines. Also, they're prepared to pay a fair bit, but they were in a very powerful position to be able to share information. So some countries that have become rather sensitive, or politically become very, very sensitive about information and privacy issues, have actually foregone these advantages. I can say with my dear mum having had health issues over the last 6-12 months, and having had relatives, including her elderly sister, 80 years old, jumping in a car and having to drive across the city to go to a doctor to pick up a medical record, to take it to a hospital, for example. Those things can have a huge impact. They can be life and death. We can get rather too obsessed about issues of privacy and become paranoid to the point where actually what we're doing is effectively locking ourselves into less flexible systems and actually giving a remarkable degree of power to local doctors, for example. If you want to get a second opinion of your medical records, it gets very awkward asking a doctor for all of those tests and everything. Why? Because I don't really trust you. I want to go and get a second opinion. When you start to think about those things. But that wasn't in my mum's case. She just needed the records, by the way. So avoiding lock-in, okay? Avoid becoming too dependent on proprietary systems or standards, okay? When people want to sell you a system where you're locked in, here's a few things they do, okay? They talk about your unique needs and your need for a customized service, a tailored service. We carefully consider every customer's needs and we tailor a solution for you. Doesn't that sound so nice? Alarm bells should be going off when you hear that discourse. First of all, tailored solution typically means more expensive solution. But it appeals to our notion that we all are unique. We all have distinctive needs. The truth is, most of the time, in most areas, we have pretty common functional needs. Okay, so off-the-shelf solutions very often work better for people. Secondly, you'll often see lock-in being presented as a positive spin on ongoing support. The classic one, and so many companies even today still get ripped off, and it's done by some of the biggest companies around in Japan in advertising industry, and you can add the names yourselves, but they always bring in contractors to do the work. The classic upsell is we'll create website for you, web services, a web profile. Okay, and very often there will be resistance to creating simple interfaces where staff within the company themselves can update the website, can make changes, and they'll try and sell a service contract there. So a related company, typically one of their subsidiaries, for example, will provide ongoing support. As soon as you hear ongoing support, you're paying for that. No one gives you support for free, okay? Not even your friends. Well, maybe you're lucky with your friends too, but everything has a cost, okay? There is no such thing as a free lunch. So as soon as you hear that, you should be, alert to the thought, oh my God, here we go. Every time we need to update this or make some kind of basic changes, we're going to be billed for it. And I could tell you lots of stories that I've heard from friends who are on the client side. And it's like, no, we want some basic functionality here. We need to be in control of this. So who controls your data? Who controls the applications? Is there interoperability? Okay. Does it work, interface with other accepted applications out there in the industry? And the presence of independent service organizations or not, okay? Or are you going to be held up with proprietary providers? One of the things, for example, photocopying machines. Okay, you buy a photocopying machine, and there's a service contract with it. Sounds like a great deal, a bit of a package, and then you read the fine print, and you've got to buy the paper from them, for example. A common thing is, and people don't understand the full rip-offs here. Elderly who are a bit affluent, maybe they've got some land, they are looking for a retirement income, they get approached by so maybe a company like, say, Daiwa House, where you say, okay, well, we'll build you a Toshibuken, an investment apartment, and we'll put this up, and we'll do a one-stop thing. You won't have to worry about it all. It'll be all very simple. It'll be a package, okay? We will manage it through our Kunri Geisha, and we've got efficient, nice integration here, and we'll do the maintenance as well. So we'll have the separate maintenance contract, and you won't even have to worry yourself about paying for all these extra services because we will collect the rent. We've got another business which does that. Okay, these necessary expenses will be taken, and we'll even do the maintenance, the periodic maintenance. Lo and behold, they'll have their own maintenance company as well. And what will they do? Very often there will be chronic over-servicing and upselling. So there will be trailing rents or commissions that you will pay and pay and pay and pay and pay, okay? And you've often bundled yourself into this package. It's very difficult to unpick. You'll see it all the time, back margins, and be very, very careful with real estate in Japan, with rental properties. One of the recent scams, well, it's been around for a while now, is you get the chintai, the rental arrangement, and you go to complete the contract and plan about picking up the key, and they say, oh, by the way, we're partnering with this security company, Alsok or something like that, and Gensok Toshite, you know, and on principle, we want you to sign up for this as well. And of course, the agents involved are going to get an extra margin on it. And they can't force you to do it, but they'll make it look like you have to. Okay. Also, the Hoshogaisha, the guarantor business, that's another classic shakedown to find margins, but that one is more difficult to escape. But the security angle, and there's so many other kind of ones on these. Sometimes bundling in internet services as well too as part of the rental arrangement. And modern economies, to a very remarkable degree, have a large strata of white-collar workers employed in organizations which are really involved in just upselling or reselling the work done by other people in non-transparent ways. And it's sustainable because very often it's underpinned by some kind of either lock-in or information asymmetry. And that's often very deliberately designed. For example, in the advertising industry with the creative, very often there is a deliberate keeping of the client away from the people who are doing the creative work. Okay, so whenever you're securing services, make sure that you have multiple potential providers of these services. Now the security is knocking on my door. Excuse me a moment. I think I'm going to leave that in. This happens every single night. There's a sign on the door, do not disturb. But anyway, the poor guy, the security guy has to come around and knock on the door and ask me what time I'm going to leave. And I always say exactly the same thing. And they don't care what time I really leave. They just have to tick a box to say that they know, but they never really know. The idea is if the building burns down at a certain time, they'll say, we understand that we're going to be 3 people in the building, but they never check against when people have actually left. Okay, pure formalism, and everyone's getting paid, and they feel kind of happy. But most of the time I stay later than I say I would, so my charred remains may be found if there's a fire. It's all completely and utterly pointless. Anyway, I guess there's a learning opportunity in being disturbed. Okay, so where was I? As actually my father used to say to me all the time, where was I when I was so rudely interrupted? I think because he was a high school teacher. He used to say that pretty much every day at work. Okay, be wary of one-stop shops, total solutions providers, and any requirements or upselling packages that come along. Be wary of things that involve the exclusive use of one supplier. Be wary of loyalty programs. Okay, and very importantly, think beyond the contract period. A long product life may still lock you in. Okay, what does that simply mean? That if you've bought a product with particular technical attributes that needs to be serviced, long after the warranty period, for example, you still have to go back to Mercedes-Benz to buy spare parts, and they can still charge that German premium car brand price for the components. Okay, so dilemmas. Well, when a lock-in risk is evident, of course, companies are going to try and avoid that. On the seller side, this is a problem. If the very nature of your product means that there is inherently an element of lock-in, you have to do a lot to offer assurance. This is Airbus versus Boeing. If you buy a Boeing aircraft, it obviously has to be serviced according to Boeing manuals, Boeing standards. You're dependent on Boeing components. There's a huge array of compliance issues. So you're really selling systems. You're not just selling a product. And Boeing and Airbus both completely understand that. Airlines themselves make a very conscious decision to bear the costs of the risks of lock-in to get efficiencies. Now, you could do dual sourcing. You could very deliberately have some Boeing and some Airbus to strengthen your negotiating hand with both of them in one sense. But effectively, you would be introducing very high fixed costs. You wouldn't be able to take pilots off these planes and put them onto these other planes or service crew or whatnot. So the interchangeability would be lost. And one of the standard features of the LCC, the low-cost carriers in the airline industry, is that they use only one kind of aircraft because everything is interchangeable. The parts, the crew, the cabin crew, the pilots, the maintenance staff, and whatnot. And there are other ways to overcome the lock-in risk. Some ways that people do this to use a mixture of directly purchased planes and leased planes. The lease arrangements normally have conditions where you can return them in more favorable circumstances in the short term, for example. So you have lower initial costs and greater flexibility. Another thing too, of course, is the regulators in many industries are on the side of the customers because particularly for potentially high-cost industries with very significant oligopolies with only a few players, the regulators are there always looking for evidence of abuse. And some Japanese companies have found themselves facing investigations, sometimes actual charges for alleged price fixing in certain industries, for example, related to semiconductors and whatnot in the past, both in Europe and the United States. So in any circumstances where the very nature of your product involves an element of lock-in, businesses must anticipate that their clients will fear this. And lock-in is very widespread. If you buy a SLR or a mirrorless camera, any camera that has interchangeable lenses, that is a really difficult consumer choice for the very simple reason that it's not just one camera, that you're buying into a system. And once you've bought 3 or 4 or 5 lenses, there is a very substantial degree of lock-in to switch to a different maker. For example, I used Nikon for many years, and so I had a whole bunch of old Nikon lenses, and then some later on, of course, for that very reason, then bought another Nikon DSLR. And then when we went to having to do lots of things online and shooting a lot of video, I went and bought myself a new Nikon mirrorless camera. There are some other very, very tempting offers out there. Fujifilm does some very good cameras, for example. Of course, Sony and Canon do great cameras. But in the end, just simply because I had all these kind of legacy lenses, it was so natural for me to stay with Nikon. And, people who are seriously thinking about buying a camera for videography or mixed videography, photography, friends of mine, I don't always recommend the Nikon. And indeed, I often point people to Fujifilm, for example, if they're not going to be doing really really high resolution stills photography, if they don't need a full frame sensor, if they're going to be doing much more video and they want a certain compactness but some very fine features. Fujifilm is actually very nicely, cleverly positioned camera, and I still from time to time kind of covet them, but I'm with Nikon because the switching costs are so high. And in fact, I've also picked up a whole bunch of gear from my dad who doesn't use it anymore, for example. So we're always going to have this dilemma. Now, a little bit just on credible commitment and threat. Okay, if a university professor with so much at stake reputationally, threatens to beat you up in the pub, it's not very credible. University professors know that if they get arrested, it's going to be pretty damaging to their career and life prospects. Okay, it's not a good look. Indeed, rule number one with professors is always walk away from trouble. Okay, try and be beyond it. We have academic tenure. We have a good secure job. Why would you ruin it for on a point of pride in a pub fight? Okay. Bikies, on the other hand, have a lot to gain from standing their ground and getting a reputation for being intimidating. This, by the way, is a demonstration by a whole bunch of motorbikers in the UK who were demanding a change to the tax rate regime, or the registration regime that actually applied to motorbikers. Okay, so if a bunch of bikies come around, even although they may be just a bunch of middle-aged men having a midlife crisis, at very least the association of the bikies with being a bunch of tough asses, we get that. Okay, it's probably everyone needs a bikie friend to make sure that bills are paid and whatnot. So we can see under some circumstances acting a little bit mad, a little bit crazy, having a reputation for being a bit of crazy dude, can work in your favor, because there are many circumstances where punishing non-cooperative behavior extremely is actually not rational. Okay, if someone is holding you up as a supplier, imagine you're an event producer, you're planning weddings, for example, and someone's not delivering the flowers, okay? And they call you up and they say, yeah, it's going to cost you a bit more, some story, okay, you don't want to disappoint the bride and the groom and the guests, so you're like, okay, get me the flowers. I mean, in the back of your mind, you think, I'm never going to use this person again. If, on the other hand, you're seen as someone who would just completely lose it and say, no, damn your flowers and damn the whole lot, people are going to be less likely to do this to you in the first place. So reputation for being a bit crazy can work. Sometimes a reputation for locking yourself in can work, can shift the negotiation dynamics. The classic one is the burn your boat situation, a very famous instance of I don't know if it's apocryphal or historically true or not. Supposedly the English invaders in France, they sieged to a castle, and the French thought, we'll just wait for them to go home. They're going to get sick of this, they'll go home. And then the English burnt their boats and meant they couldn't retreat. And then the French thought, damn, they're not going away. And eventually they gave up and opened the castle to them. Okay, so it's referred to as this burn your boats. Make it impossible for you to retreat. And arguably companies do this through very publicly adopting a certain position, okay, to effectively lock yourself in reputationally. So there's a whole bunch of circumstances where threats are not actually credible, okay? Think about when a party is unlikely to carry it out because it's not in their interest to do so. A classic one, academics kind of have this all the time, is, because it's always a struggle with deadlines, publishing projects or events, you get someone who gets officious and they said, well, I'm going to need your slides for the presentation for this coming Saturday. I'm going to need them by Tuesday afternoon. And you say, no, I can't do them Tuesday afternoon. I'll send you on Friday. No, absolutely, I must have them on Wednesday. And what are you going to do? You've advertised the event. My name's on the program. If I don't turn up on Saturday, you've got a hole in your program. You're going to look silly. So if you want to be a real bastard, and I like being a bastard in those circumstances because I don't like people setting arbitrary deadlines, I tend to write saying, so just let me clarify. If I don't send my slides to you by Tuesday afternoon, I'm off the program. Fine by me, because I would like to go to the beach on Saturday. Do you want me to do it on Saturday or not? If so, you'll have the slides on Friday afternoon. Okay? And what happens Friday afternoon will be okay, because if you've got a big event, the last thing you want is a hole in it. Okay? But there's always some jumped up, annoying, officious little annoying person who is on a bit of a power trip, who wants to get things kind of organized. They want to know it's there. And normally you can just, yeah, rightio, yeah, okay, no, yes, no, right, very good. Blackmail, a whole bunch of cases. We could talk about this. Blackmail, if you understand some tactics in dealing with it, is actually pretty avoid. Okay, deadlines are threats that other parties don't want to enforce. Always ask yourself, okay, what happens for them? You know, the classic one is someone gets a bit grumpy, they're a bit anxious, and they want something from you, and they say, I need this now, this is really important. My suggested response is, well, if it's that important to you, you'd better ask me nicely. That will piss them off so much, okay? But it will also very clearly remind people that, I've got something you need, okay? So I'm holding you up, and other people do it to you all the time. Don't take advantage of this, don't abuse it, but keep in mind that very often people are being anxious or just simply controlling and unreasonable, and if you've got something they want, you're actually in quite a strong position. But as I've already mentioned the example in relation to the wedding organizer, for example, being unforgiving can often be very costly. You cancel an order because the supplier, is late, leaves the customer without the needed product, and that can be absolutely disastrous to your own reputation. So the notion of forgive and forget, it's in the Christian Bible. No. You may choose to forgive, but never forget. Never forget. Okay? And I wouldn't even be that forgiving. You may, in practical terms, say, I'm not happy about this, but all right, get them here as soon as you possibly can. But next time round, make sure that you kind of lock them in some way, or you demand some compensation. Industries generally have a whole range of mechanisms for dealing with this kind of bad behavior. In the construction industry, it's very common to have what's called chargebacks, for example. When someone doesn't deliver properly on what they say, and they're very slow to come and fix it, then simply someone on the site will call them and say, look, this hasn't been done, and the other work can't proceed without it. We're going to have to bring a third party in to do what you're not doing. There will be a chargeback. Okay, a chargeback means that, okay, we've agreed to pay this certain amount of money, but you're not delivering part of your or your contractual obligations, so we will charge back to you some of the costs involved. So we will pay you less. Okay. Broader takeaway here, short-term forgiveness therefore leads to long-term declines in performance and higher costs. And this is ubiquitous. And you think about this in family dynamics, and it is always a dilemma, tactical dilemma. Do you be forgiving in the short term to get through a difficult moment, knowing that you're actually reinforcing bad behavior? So there are tactics to say, okay, you're really holding me up here. Discourse it. You're taking advantage of me. You're holding me up. I'm very unhappy about this, but I need the flowers. I'm not going to disappoint the bride, but this will be costly. Okay. You will make this up to me later on. Okay. I will not be forgetting this, and it is on you, and really have to emphasize that repeatedly. Otherwise, people will take advantage of you. So be incredible. Okay. Burn your boats, burn your bridges, as I've spoken about here. The critical thing in terms of showing your commitment to a business proposal normally is through bond posting, for example. If you're pitching to someone, hey, invest in this project, we've got this business we're starting. Please get involved. They understandably are going to say, well, what's in it for you? What are the benefits for you? And what are you staking here? How much skin do you have in the game? How much are you investing here? How much do you stand to lose? There's a writer, a very influential writer, with a book recently that literally is titled Skin in the Game. Just simply ask people, what do they have to lose if the deal fails? Okay, and that will show how confident they really are about whether this will work. Okay, if someone's putting all of their life savings into a project, at very least that's a very strong indication that they believe it's a good project. They may not be right about that, they may be wildly optimistic, but at very least it speaks to their commitment. Okay, and we see Lockin in so many ways is really about demonstrating your commitment to the long-term relationship. One form of lock-in, for example, is Japanese customers for major mining projects, coal, iron ore, liquid natural gas, LNG, for example, coming from my country, Australia, very often would take a small equity stake in the project. They might buy, say, a 5% share in the mine to underpin long-term contracts, say a 20-year-long contract. They say, we will be buying from your product, from your mine, from your LNG operations for the next 20 years. And so we want to be on both sides of the transaction. We will step in as a minor owner on your side of the transaction to show our serious commitment to this deal. Sometimes giving up control is another way to do this as well. Okay, the notion of kind of binding yourself. The very famous story of Ulysses and the sirens, worried about the temptation of the siren's call. He anticipates that these evil beasts that take the form of beautiful women who sing from the shore and lure sailors to their deaths, which was then shown in Pirates of the Caribbean as well. Ulysses famously ties himself to the mast to avoid the siren's call. You will hear this all the time. This is not ambulances, but the call of the sirens, the call of temptation. Okay, so sometimes organizationally, people very deliberately remove themselves from decision making, or they set a tripwire. A tripwire can be something as simple as having a decision rule that I will not spend more than 10,000 yen without having a cup of coffee first to decide whether I really want this thing. Or I will ask my partner, or the boss has to sign off on every purchase over a certain amount. Okay, so you can setting all of these things. Another thing that's very common in terms of credible threats is to set an example. And there are lots of metaphors about this, Chinese metaphors and many others. I used to team teach with a guy who was an army officer. I always used to be an army officer. He said, never waste your time yelling at a group of people. Always yell at one. Always make an example of one person. And it's particularly effective because everyone else stops to watch. Because people do love a spectacle, especially when it involves someone else suffering. Remember, we used to have public executions and thousands of people would turn up. So, someone go, whoa, they like to kind of watch. But at the same time, they're thinking, ooh, I'm glad that's not me, okay? So we will often see companies being very tough, maybe suing someone to make an example of them, to send a message to others. Or if there is some abuse of resources, very spectacularly firing a manager, or closing down a subsidiary because of an accounting scandal, for example, to send a message to the entire group company globally. As I've already said, looking crazy can be good for businesses. It's often said that if you get sent to a very tough prison, you want to look like a crazy dude and just, violently attack someone in the first few days of being there. Just to send a message that you're not to be messed with. Generally in normal business, it's not a good idea. Okay, so discouraging new competitors. A lot of people think we'll just aggressively discount and scare them off. Okay, it actually doesn't work very well because it's not a particularly credible threat because prices can be changed all the time. Okay, what is far more credible that really locks you in is aggressive investment in new productive capacity. buying new aeroplanes, showing that you're continuing to expand your own capacity and that you have absolutely no intention of leaving space in the market for a new competitor. That's a much more credible thing to do. Now, sometimes people try and lock in key clients with long contracts at discount prices. It can work. It could also get you in trouble with regulators. And of course, the clients can see that coming a mile off. They know that you're coming with a good deal precisely because there's a potential rival provider turning up in the market. So you want to assume that the people you're dealing with are not dumb, okay? That's a really good starting position, and to go from there. So remember, there is so much more cooperation than competition in business. That's something I emphasized very early on in the course. So signaling mutual commitment, we do this in so many ways, bond posting or whatnot, or very often just public displays of mutual commitment. So we see all the time that companies are announcing that they're entering into partnerships or alliances or MOUs, for example. And look at this couple. I actually snuck up on this couple and took pictures of them. I thought, now, that's tune in love. These are just middle-aged folks feeling the love that they haven't felt for a while. Because how else to explain two orange matching shirts? Okay. It is nice when you're in the wedding season in the airport in Seoul too, and you see all the honeymoon couples with the pair look. I don't know how the guys ever get talked into that, but the head to toe, the matching polo shirts and the sneakers and all the rest of it says we're a couple and we're in love and we're committed to each other. That's a very public display of commitments. And they weren't Dutch football supporters, by the way. They were speaking Swedish, okay? We kind of publicly go out there and signal our commitment. And a final anecdote on this. There's a story often told about Baron Rothschild in Paris, that he wouldn't lend money to people who need, friends who needed finance for a business. Instead, he did something that was actually rather more valuable. Rather than just give them the loan and then complicate for the person receiving the loan, having to borrow from someone who was a friend, that he would actually dine with them very prominently, very publicly, in a restaurant that was favored by other financiers. Because when Baron Rothschild dined with someone, everyone paid attention. And so literally to just be seen in a public place was his way of sending a signal to everybody else. This person is good to be dealt with, okay? So in a sense, lending your reputation. And that's what we've seen in the context of finance as well, that this is what accounting firms do. Effectively, they lend their reputation to each other. So a public commitment to work with another company signals mutual commitment because you're staking your brand, your reputation publicly there. And that in itself is quite a powerful thing. And it's to a significant degree how anthropologists have understood the historical role of the wedding ceremony. Because marriage was never really just about love. It was also about families coming together and communities kind of coming together. So it was really an instance of signaling commitment and then getting buy-in from a whole range of other stakeholders around them.